On behalf of Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to GLF's Brave New World. 100 episodes and 4.5 million views later, we're delighted to be back with GLF's Brave New World Season 2. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, journalism with a human touch. Those of you who missed our earlier episode, the sad guest, Matthias Navarat in conversation with Janaki Ray, you can catch this on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF, and on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest. Our next session today is Art Matters. Jitish Kallat in conversation with Sarah Suzuki. The session is presented with the support of Nature Mort in Delhi. Frequently shifting between the registers of the self, the city street, the nation, and the cosmic horizon, Jitish Kallat's art is a speculative field of inquiry interspersed with the concept of time, sustenance, recursion, and historical recall. In a conversation with the Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs at the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, New York, Sarah Suzuki, Kallat takes us on a journey of his creative process and his wide-ranging artistic preoccupations. Jitish Kallat's work, for those of you who don't know, has been exhibited widely with solo exhibitions at museums, including the Art Institute of Chicago, which was incredible, the First Art Museum, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art, amongst others. In 2017, the NGMA New Delhi also presented a mid-career survey of his work. Kallat was the curator and artistic director of Kochi Museeris Biennale 2014. Sarah Suzuki was named Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs at the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, in 2020. At MoMA, her exhibitions include Bodies Isaac Kengeles, City Dreams, A Revolutionary Impulse, The Rise of the Russian Avant-Garde, Soldier, Spectre, Shaman, The Figure in the Second World War, Scenes for a New Heritage, Contemporary Art from the collection of Jean Dubuffet, Soul of the Underground, The Paris of Toulouse, Prints and Posters. All our sessions that have been broadcast are available on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Please do remember to ask questions and comment by typing it into the comment section below, and Sarah will ask these of Jitish. You could also ask Sarah questions should you wish. And in case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. And in case we drop off, just hang in there. We'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, Art Matters. Jitish Kallat in conversation with Sarah Suzuki. Jitish, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Sanjoy, for that incredibly warm welcome. And Jitish, I don't know about you, but I have to say that seeing that great intro piece makes me feel incredibly nostalgic for the last time I was in Jaipur for the Litfest. It is such an extraordinary event, and I think I speak for both of us when I say we are absolutely thrilled to be with you all today. I am coming to you from Midtown Manhattan, from the Museum of Modern Art on 53rd Street here in New York City. Jitish, where are we finding you today?
Well, in the studio that's close to my home. That's just in the suburb of Bandra in the city of Mumbai.
So we are separated by thousands of miles and multiple time zones, and yet here we are. And I will say that I am here today, yes, as the Deputy Director of the Museum of Modern Art, but also as a longtime friend of this incredible artistic mind and someone who's been following his work for many years. And it's, I think, our excitement today to take you on a journey with us through some of the really big ideas that drive your practice, Jitish, and the way that they've manifested themselves in different ways over the course of the years. We had a chance to kind of touch base yesterday, and I think we're both reminded of the last time we were in person together, which was, I think, was it March 12th?
Well, it was March 6th.
March 6th.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it was just before the world went into cancellation mode.
before the world went into cancellation mode. And we met here in New York. The very next day, Jitish traveled to Nashville, Tennessee for a project that we're going to talk about in a minute. But I remember the day after he left, we heard in New York that there had been a tornado in Nashville. And of course, our first thoughts were of you having arrived and the work that you were trying to do. And in retrospect, it seems like a portent for the ways in which the world was going to become an incredible maelstrom in the months since. But, you know, as we talked yesterday, I know that one of the things that we said to each other was that one of the strangest aspects of the last couple of months is the way in which time has seemed to take on an entirely new elastic sense. That in these kind of self-isolated pods, things that happened yesterday feel like they could have happened 6 months ago, and vice versa. And I think time is one of the things that really comes to the fore in your work. So somehow this feels like an incredibly apt moment in which to hear from you, someone who's been thinking so deeply about the way that time shapes our experiences, the way that time shapes history, the way time is unknowable and unmanageable. So I think we have no better guide in this moment than you. And with that, I would love to start by talking about, I'm going to screen share with everyone if I can do it. I think we should start by talking about, and I hope everyone can see my screen, the project that you were headed to Nashville to install when we saw each other in March. This is at the Frisch Museum of Art, and it's a work called Covering Letter. And I wonder, Jitish, if you would start just by sharing with all of us just what it is that we're seeing here in this image.
Firstly, Sarah, thank you so much for this conversation. It's just such a delight every time we've met in person, but this is the best alternative, and we have other people with us joining us. So I'm thrilled that we can do this together. At the sort of center of this work is really, it's a piece called Covering Letter Terranum Nuncius. And at the center of this work is a large round table with 116 images on it. And these 116 images are the entire corpus of images that were uploaded onto the two golden records in 1977 and dispatched into outer space by NASA as a kind of message to an interstellar spacefaring alien, because this message is likely to clearly outlive us as a species, or outlive even perhaps planet Earth, because in the vastness of empty space, this could continue its onward journey. So at the heart of this work, I think, is this return to a set of images which are meant to speak about us as a summary of life on Earth, to an entity that may encounter it perhaps even after we are gone. But clearly, if not a distant space in time, but a distant space in space itself, far away from us, because it's hurtling away from us at something like 17 kilometers per second, even as we speak. And these 116 images are not exactly the images which were uploaded, because in 1977, you didn't have that kind of computing capacity to upload that many images on a disk. So they were encoded as tiny sound files. And the images that I have worked with are images that a California-based programmer named Ron Barry has converted back from sound images, almost like excavating these images from sound, the way in which an alien in a faraway space might have to do. So in a way, the work kind of cycles in that territory of circulation between the manner in which it was dispatched and the manner in which it might be encountered in the future. But what permeates the space, as you might see a suspended horn screens or horn speakers at the back, these essentially sort of beam and percolate the space with these 55 messages to the universe in 55 languages. So they're essentially greetings to the universe, which are also from the Golden Record. And at the back is a projection, which was a diagram, literally a kind of return address that was placed onto the disk as a suggestion of where we might exist in this wide cosmic neighborhood that we live in. It was assumed that the 14 pulsars, which were noted in 1977 to be what they call steady candles or whatever that will tell you that we're going to be around this location, was meant to be, these pulsars were the indication that this is where you could find us. But as many things, Sarah, even our own sense of location in this universe seems quite uncertain, because in the years gone by, we know that there are not 14 pulsars, but a few 100,000 pulsars in our immediate cosmic neighborhood. So this address won't get us to connect to any of our distant sentient life anywhere else in the universe. But I think at the heart of this work, Sarah, is something that we even spoke of yesterday a little bit, was this inability for this current moment to allow for a shared vocabulary across differing ideologies or differing mindsets, that it almost seems like there's no vocabulary to speak to the other, and that's become a kind of global phenomenon in some ways. And to me, I think the work became sort of compelling as a line of inquiry, because of the fact that in this case the letter is dispatched to another which is really so unknown in every way, that the question remains, what does it do to the sender? What does it do to the sense of self of the sender? And I think somewhere in that territory is really the heart of the work.
Absolutely. I mean, there's something incommensurate almost about the idea that in 1977 there was an agreement on some 55 images that a group of people felt could be a shared, almost intergalactic introduction to who we were. And one of the things I'm curious about is, as you kind of translated those sound files into these image files, was there anything there that really surprised you in this moment in 2018, 2019, as you were developing this project, that our predecessors thought about as critical kind of baseline material for who we are as a human species?
Actually, what's really interesting about this, and this was primarily composed by a group of individuals chaired by Frank Drake and Carl Sagan. And what's really interesting is this deep necessity felt by the people composing it to kind of find vocabulary that might speak to, we don't know what. We can't even say who. And hence, certain measurements, diagram, almost like an algebraic rendition of placeholder suggestions are sort of put into this narrative, which is of course a narrative of human species, United Nations building, and animals and reptiles and birds. But clearly, to an extraterrestrial, it could the sender could well as well be in the reptile and not the human. So really, there is some sort of yearning in this to even sort of communicate not only a kind of planetary narrative, but I think a narrative that goes beyond species-specific nervous systems, which might be the language of mathematics, arithmetics, geometry, which it was assumed that a spacefaring species would have a greater intelligence to perhaps understand. And I think, to me, that yearning for a vocabulary is really interesting at the heart of this project.
The vocabulary and that the right kind of vector through which to communicate, through which to find that shared understanding that could potentially create the opportunity for dialogue. And in fact, I think this idea is something that's, how do you kind of bring together these incommensurate positions is something that you've explored in a very terrestrial way in another project. And I'd love if we could talk for a moment about Covering Letter, which is a project that likewise takes the form of a kind of correspondence, but one rooted in reality and rooted in history from 2012. And I wonder if you would just share a little bit about this project and what I'm really curious about, how you found this piece of correspondence and why it spoke to you so strongly.
Sarah, Covering Letter from 2012 is really the predecessor of Covering Letter Terrendum Nuncius. So it's 8 years later that the second covering letter came about. But this piece, I think it really, for me, remained somewhere in my notebooks as a kind of compelling thought for a few years, 3 or 4 years, since maybe around 2008 or 9, when I first encountered the letter in a very sort of unremarkable corner of this very beautiful Gandhi museum in Bombay called the Mani Bhavan. And there's a facsimile on display amongst several other letters. But clearly what I think was most compelling was the 7-line persuasion that Gandhi makes in the letter, beginning with the word "dear friend" and ending with the words "your sincere friend." And I think that complicates this letter, because obviously the recipient is somebody that most people would not have assumed could allow for any dimension of friendship to occur. But as Gandhi wrote several years later in a second letter, that in my world of universal friendship, I know no foe. So I think really it's in this universal space of friendship with not a possibility of animosities where I think he writes the letter from. But it's really a 7-line plea asking Adolf Hitler to rethink his ways in the world. And this, as when you encounter it in the work, of course, you see it as a film of mist. And there's this cascade of words that keep flowing on the ground. As you move towards the letter, you go from darkness to progressive illumination until you are in full illumination at the very moment when you are actually within the letter, with inhabiting it with your body. It's only when the letter begins to leave that you notice really that the letter is from Gandhi and to Hitler, as you see the signatory and the recipient's name at the very end. And it's also you realize with the date that this was written 5 weeks before the onset of the Second World War. And I think a bit like this binary position between a sender-recipient relationship, which is so apart in the case of the previous covering letter that we spoke of, I think here again, it almost feels like the letter to one of the greatest or perhaps the most brutal perpetrator of violence had to come from one of the greatest proponents of peace, kind of cohabiting the planet at that same moment in time. And I think at the heart of the work for me, Sarah, is really the moment of the encounter in some ways, the sort of physical act of moving through the darkness into progressive illumination, but also this possibility to be in the letter, to sort of traverse it as the letter continues to atomize, break up, and form again. After the departure of the previous reader, it sets itself back for the next reader.
One of the things I've been struck by when I've had the opportunity to experience this work, and again, the source material is a letter, 1939, from Gandhi to Adolf Hitler. It starts, "Dear friend, friends have been urging me to write to you for the sake of humanity." And he goes on to say, "It is quite clear that you are today the one person in the world who can prevent a war which may reduce humanity to the savage state." And as you point out, this letter from someone whose entire life was devoted to peace, to someone who is remembered today as the personification of hate, destruction, and violence, it's an incredible kind of one-to-one reaching out. And when we think about covering letter, the recent version, and how that's actually a species trying to reach out to not even another species, to an unknown, there's kind of a beautiful play of scales happening in that. But as I was saying, the thing that I've always been struck by in experiencing this is the way that I as an individual affect this work. As I move through it, I interrupt that flow of mist, that flow of correspondence. And it's always made me think of each of us and our own agency as we move through the world, and the power that each of us has within us. Is that, how do you think about that in this work, and that kind of interaction between the individual and this environment that you've created for us?
The letter also reaches out in first person, Sarah. So as we walk in, it really addresses you as saying, "Dear friend." And I think, so hence it becomes, and, it says, "I have been resisting from writing," and, "I have been." So between the eye of the sender to the friendship extended to the reader, it is an invitation for self-reflection. So I think at the heart of the work is really this question of how does one read, how does one ingest this letter, how does one metabolize it in this present moment. And the previous time it came to the East Coast of the United States was really just weeks before the previous election. So America is right in the middle of that same cycle again. And it opened in Philadelphia Museum just literally 2 days after the election verdict. And I think the bitter campaign that had played out, I think a lot of people who took in the work were taking it against the backdrop of what they had internalized just in the weeks prior. And I think I've had, probably the most memorable exchanges with individuals who saw the work in Philadelphia just because of the moment. So I think the letter sort of reincarnates in different contexts, in different moments, and in different people at different times.
And I on that note, I'd love to move us from this kind of private one-to-one letter and this very kind of contemplative, meditative experience that one has when experiencing this work to something that's in fact far more public and is cited for a very public space. This is Public Notice, which was installed in 2010 at the Art Institute of Chicago, which is in a quite storied, well, for American history, historic building in downtown Chicago. And the exhibition was inaugurated on September 11th, 2010, and in fact marked that date in recent history and in further back history as it relates to this building. Do you want to share a little bit with us about the kind of setting for Public Notice?
In a way, Sarah, it's interesting. While I was looking at our images, we are actually going back in reverse across stations of certain pauses in the work, in reverse, these were sort of works that one led to the other. So I think as you rightly point out, while there's a kind of closure, a kind of intimacy of scale to covering letter, Public Notice essentially just kind of opens out, and it unfolds literally in a kind of interstitial space, the space between risers of steps on the grand staircase of the Art Institute of Chicago, with a speech. And this speech was delivered on September 11th, but 1893, exactly 108 years before the attacks on the World Trade Center, was this moment when the United States hosted the first World Parliament of Religions in Chicago at this very building. In 1893, on 9/11, this very building was the auditorium where the parliament took place. And the inaugural speech was delivered by an Indian religious leader, Swami Vivekanand, calling for an end to fanaticism, fundamentalism, bigotry, intolerance. These were all words from the speech. And these are words that, ironically and rather sadly, began to sort of entirely populate our discourse, most notably since 9/11, 2001. And it almost felt like these words meant for 9/11, 2001 was sort of spoken 108 years prior, for us to reflect again on where the world had moved. And so the work actually sort of almost articulates itself through this overlay of dates, but also with a kind of overlay of the very site. So its place and time kind of get enwrapped in a certain way in the work. And it unfolds in this kind of refractive kind of form where the 5 colors that you see it refract in, rather than 7, it's the 5 colors that the US Homeland Security had marked as threat levels. And it remained for 10 years since 2001 until 2010, mostly severe and high every day as the Homeland Security would beam the threat level. And somewhere in the middle of this exhibition, Sarah, Obama had become the president, and by then this was repealed midway through the course of the exhibition. And there was this little, burst of humor on the email chats at the museum saying that we changed state policy. But clearly, I mean, obviously, this is just a coincidence. But I think it's really through this kind of refraction of these words, through the signaling of the threat codes, it kind of is where you internalize these words that call for the very opposite, this kind of oxymoronic world that we live in, where, wars are fought on terror, whereas wars are really terror in a way. So this is actually the very floor plan, Sarah. So this is the exact location of the auditorium. And yeah, I think also the Art Institute being this kind of, being an encyclopedic museum, you always have these incredible objects that produce these sightlines as you move in the museum, but also as you move through the museum, you have to crisscross through this twinned structure of the grand staircase, because it doubles at the base, but it quadruples at the top. So in a way, the same set of words are at both first landing and second landing, and then as you go to the upper levels, it quadruples. So anyone taking any path in the museum essentially encounters the same set of words. But if they do feel that they haven't read what's on the other side, then it almost creates like an echo of the same words as you kind of reread them.
One of the things that was so striking to me about this project was how deeply researched it was, how multivalent, bringing in these different moments of history, so precisely considering this space, which is this kind of intersection within this historical building, and thinking through the ways that people will flow through. I mean, just considered really on every level. And it's one of the reasons I was delightfully surprised by another more recent series of work that you've been doing called the Wind Studies. Because I think in a career in which you have so thoughtfully considered and structured so many aspects of what the viewer experiences, the Wind Studies really invite chance in a very different kind of way. Would you talk a little bit about the process of how you make these extraordinary works on paper?
Yeah, Sarah, as they almost, as you rightly point out, perhaps the other end of my own sort of artistic speculations, because at one level, there's this tendency in the work to kind of mine what is the tangible, what is existing in some kind of archival form, which has a date, which has a location, which has context, which can be felt as material. And at other times, I think I think perhaps what gives me perhaps some degree of insight or inquiry into all of these other territories, this other tendency in the work to kind of go through areas which are completely unfathomable to me when I sort of proceed in those directions. So the Wind Studies kind of began sometime about 4 or 5 years ago, and the first Wind Studies began with kind of drawings which were kind of very randomly drawn within the studio. There were lines and circles. Of course, there's a little backgrounder to this. Perhaps I won't go into the manner in which artworks sort of position themselves in your life, But and then these drawings are actually taken to the backyard of the studio and laid flat on a table. And then I lay kind of one line at a time with a kind of inflammable fluid and set it aflame. As the line sort of is set aflame and a fire erupts, it's at that very moment that a mild breeze, which is otherwise not just invisible but almost imperceptible to me on my body, begins to suddenly become visible through the fire. And it's almost as if the drawing slowly begins to make audible a kind of almost like a transcript of a little elemental action in the atmosphere in the backyard of the studio, which otherwise I have no access to. Slowly begins to reveal at the end of the drawing a sort of durational map of what occurred in that moment around the drawing, and it's really the two elements that I think in some ways it's also transformed the way I work, Sarah. I mean, I've There was 5 years when I didn't paint, but when I returned to painting, if I hadn't made these wind studies, I would probably not paint the way I do today. It's just almost a desire to meet an image halfway. Whereas I think, 15 years ago or something, I'd roll up my sleeves, climb up ladders, and feel that I'm making the image. But it's now that I almost feel that there is a space from where the image has to appear for you. And I go halfway and I wait, some ways. I think the drawings have changed the way I function in the studio.
I'm curious to ask you, there's a group of drawings of wind studies that you made specifically around the work of a mathematician called David Hilbert. And this is one example. And part of what I find so interesting about this is that the wind studies invite this kind of elemental participation, as you've explained, and one that is subject to what the breeze is doing in that moment. It's not something that one can necessarily control. But what you've added in here is actually a quite logical geometry to kind of underlie that unanticipated and uncontrollable aspect. So a really interesting, I think, tension between the idea of a kind of system and something that can't be controlled. Would you talk a little bit about the Hilbert drawings in particular?
So this entire drawing, as you see it, Sarah, is a single line. It just curls back into itself from a small order of magnitude to larger orders of magnitude, cycling back to a smaller order of magnitude. Each time, every turn of the curve of Hilbert curve almost functioning like a self-similar fractal, which is really what this space-filling curve by the mathematician David Hilbert is. It's essentially a geometric fractal that can go to planetary scales and help map things like IP addresses, but also shrink down to become spatial notations even at a molecular scale. And I think that had a deep resonance in some ways to my thinking as well. I think it just felt like if a single line can curl through these orders of magnitude and also seek out space, because one thing that we artists or curators and all of us working in the field think of is time and space. We deeply contemplate this and are searching for ways to kind of mine this. And there was a deep affinity in a mathematician doing the same thing with numbers and form, because there's form and the numbers correlating. And I think while I didn't get to the numbers, I went to the form. And I think this form then allows, the drawings are laid flat on a table, but it's really the curling Hilbert curve that begins to then capture the wind flows. And a completely dormant looking line drawing suddenly gets animated in the studio backyard. By the time the drawing is complete, it somehow begins to throb with some sort of a life that I think the elements feed into it. It also, I think it sublimates my sense of the artist self. I think it's just, I have to go outdoors to get the image, and then come back in. It's kind of, it also tells you that the image lies not in the studio, it's somewhere outside.
Somewhere in the world. And as our time wraps up here, which is hard to believe, I wanted to circle us back as you're talking about the idea of scale, the cosmic to the molecular and everything in between. And I think one of the projects in which you played with that really brilliantly, and one that also brings us back to our kind of first cosmic moment with Covering Letter, is Eternal Gradient, which we're looking at here. Which, if I was looking at this, I would think this was kind of a map of the phases of the moon across 12 months. How close am I?
Well, if you just speak of a single moment in the video, you're right, spot on. But Sarah, that's where I really began. I began from that single moment in the video, which is really an entire year, which is really a parenthesis of time, like a duration of time, seen through the phase of the moon. And as artists, at least, I recognize, at least as an artist, that that as you work with the form, you can never get to the fundamental. You kind of get pointers to the fundamental, and then you're kind of constantly searching for forms that are pointers for us to sort of seek out larger questions. And somehow this form of a lunar year has in it equal number of full moons and new moons. So every year kind of looks the same in terms of luminosity and darkness. But as the video begins to play out in about 3 minutes, which is a short duration of time, but in the presence of the video, it looks like nothing is moving. Unless you look away and look back and you see that the gradient has shifted a little bit. If you look at a moon, you see it slightly shaking, throbbing and enlarging or reducing. But each of these moons are also essentially rotis. They're essentially meals which are going from fullness, from abundance to dearth, darkness to light. But what's really interesting for me, Sarah, which I hadn't thought of or felt when I began making the work, it's almost as the work told me this at the end of it, was really that if you enter the work when, say, 1st of Jan is a full moon, then that moment roughly corresponds to any 1st of Jan that ever was, and any 1st of Jan that could ever be a full moon. So there's a stacking up of eons of time gone by and eons of years yet to come. As long as this basic cosmic syzygy of the sun, moon, and earth remain the same, these cycles will continue to play out whether we exist on the planet or not.
Just as that golden record will continue its journey long after we are gone from this planet. Jitish, thank you so much. I see we have questions coming in from our audience, and I do want to make sure that people have an opportunity to hear some answers from you. So let's get started. Nilanjana asks, are you thinking of developing your art around the current global situation? Because this year, after all, will go down in history as one which locked us all in. How is the isolation, how are the strictures of the COVID era influencing the way you're thinking about your work now and the things you may be working on in the studio?
It's hard to really predict, Sarah, but I do know that I just feel that having just returned actually after the opening of Covering Letter, Terran and Nuncius, and then going into isolation for 15 days in the studio across the street from home, and then returning, just exiting into a world where everyone else was also in lockdown, literally, so it just was a very peculiar. In fact, I left the United States when Trump was announcing health emergency on 13th of March. So, just having opened an exhibition that kind of reflects on some of these themes, on a sort of singular body, on the idea of us as a kind of singular unit of species, and then returning into the studio where it begins to kind of play out in a certain way, that a tiny microscopic entity that can completely change not just not just us, but I think the entire metabolism of the planet, because as we began to encounter, in fact, when you spoke in the very beginning about this sense of not knowing where time is primarily because the virus took our calendars away from us. And I think in the absence of our calendars, our planet began to sort of reconfigure. But I think, all these questions really, you actually wonder if when something like this fundamentally points out to us that something that we should know and we all know, but we never acknowledge perhaps in our skin encapsulated lives, is that really this is just one body, that there's no separation between the health of the planet and the health of a human body. That should probably bring us all together. But I think in a peculiar and sad way, it's also brought out a sort of dimension of tribalism and xenophobia and perhaps also a world where, in fact, the everyday has become a statistic. That it's become a world where not just people, but cities and states and countries are matching the statistic of the day in terms of fatality, mortality, illness and infection. And somewhere, I think this relationship between body and planet has played out in a way that I do not know at this moment what it's doing. It's doing something in the way that images have sort of become more prominent in a set of notes that weren't so prominent 8 months ago or 6 months ago. So it's kind of churned one's attention in a way, But I don't know what that's going to do to anything fundamentally as actual work.
I'm gonna follow that up with a question from Emma Abdul. And I take this question in a way as one that's about inspiration. During these times when one cannot travel and the joy that comes along with that, discovering new places, meeting new people, those things are just not possible. How do you keep yourself inspired enough? And what advice could you give the rest of us to help us stay inspired to keep doing all the things that we have to do?
Well, like when I am not traveling, this is how I tend to live my life. I mean, there's very, very occasional social commitments, and rest of the time it's a kind of a ritual between home and studio. And having one studio right across the street from home, I did not miss the other studio. So somehow there was this cycle where I returned back in March straight into the studio and stayed on, kind of. And I think, but at the same time, I know that for the world around us, it's been really a very, very difficult moment as well. I mean, it's been difficult for all of us in some way or the other, but also I think it's also really a call for all of us to reflect. And I think the fact that we don't travel, I think, is also why probably we have clearer skies. And I think why we got to acknowledge that. I think our mobility was at a price. And I think our isolation might have some, perhaps not exactly the rewards we might want or in the manner we might want it. But I think it's probably the planet resetting itself, and it's one of those, weeks in history where evolutionary transformations have been on rapid fire since the inaugural weeks of this decade. While weeks can go by, months can go by, years can go by without that evolutionary push. I think we're just on a sort of roller coaster of changes in the world. This kind of online conversations we're able to have, I think all of this is just changing and transforming us, I think, as people.
It is. And in fact, in funny ways, this period has invited a different kind of connection and participation. To be able to kind of meet in this virtual space with all of the friends that are here with us today, we wouldn't really have thought it possible, or wouldn't really have thought it the primary way we would want to have this conversation. But we're actually able to bridge great distances in this moment in a way that without the carbon footprint impact. And that's something that I myself have been inspired by, is the opportunity to reach out to that kind of global network and understand that perhaps for the first time we all are in certain shared strictures where we have something new in common. Natal asked a question about the kind of emotional roller coaster that we were just talking about, asking, do you think loneliness can be productive in a way for art? Saying a number of people have been painting or creating new work during isolation. And I would just expand that question out to be more one about all of those kind of roller coaster emotional states that I think many of us have found ourselves in the last 7 months or so. Is there one that's more productive for you? A moment, an emotional moment that you find leads to the greatest sense of creativity for you?
Well, loneliness is a kind of is a position of dearth, no? So I think loneliness as a condition perhaps may not be the best condition for life, but I think a self choice to isolate or to remain alone in a certain moment, I think, can be very productive. In fact, that's the only way art happens. Even in the midst of a very large collaboration, everyone is alone in that collaboration, contributing to that conversation. So I think it's in a deep aloneness that art happens. But I think, Sarah, at this moment, I think, I began to look at certain things which would seem completely absurd if I say it now. It might seem absurd to me as well. But I've just been looking at, the chair that I'm seated on, and I've tumbled it up and down and looked at what's happened under the chair. What's gathered as lines and marks under the foot of the chair, and they've become part of my notes. And so one of the things that began to happen for me in the last a few months is really I began to really note take on every little transformation within the architecture of the studio. And those notations have been taken as serious notes. And now that sounds absurd, which is why I'm hesitating from saying it. But to me, this condition of an emergent mark from gravity and me having produced this below this chair is also the condition of everything else that occurs in the world. So in the micro within the environment around me, I've been searching for clues to look at the larger narratives. And somewhere from these little cracks, marks, this is really some sort of a passage of time, nothing spectacular. One has to even search for them to find them, like this underside of this chair, but they exist. And I think they exist because of a condition of time and pressures that have been applied to them, here in this case by my own body. And those have become very much part of the studio log. I've been kind of registering them. So I don't know if this is answering Natal's question. Maybe this is to do with sort of restricting the geography in which one moves,
Absolutely. And as the territory maybe gets more confined, that's the opportunity for us to excavate even closer, to pay attention to those small details that maybe we miss.
And also, we've been actually circling our breath to ourselves, under a mask. And I think that's really something to think about breath on a larger scale. I think, some of my recent drawings it's really the act of just tracing these tree stems that began to create a cascade of free associations in thought. As if these were throbbing and emerging from the drawing, really moving from breath to gas exchange to chlorophyll and hemoglobin and these cycles of respiration. But equally, this thought that perhaps what triggered it is not open breath, but a closed breath, where one is actually, becoming hypoxic and hypercapnic at the same time under a mask, and I think these things have all happened, I think, in this moment of closure.
Well, Jitish, thank you for your time with us today, for reminding us of all of these scales that exist around us, from the most individual to the interplanetary and cosmic. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you. And thank you to all of you who joined us today for this session.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, JLF, for bringing both of us together. I think I totally value every dialogue we've had, Sarah. And this one just adds to that list of long conversations we've had. Thank you. Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you to the entire team of JLF.
Thank you, Jitish Kallat. And thank you, Sarah Suzuki. And absolutely right. Aloneness is how art is created. And for those of you who haven't seen the beautiful but simple, effective work that Jitish did at the Chicago Art Institute, absolutely stunning. And it's only when you get closer to it and you start reading it and you go step by step, you realize the full potential of what that work is, which is what happened to me when I visited Art Institute on a meeting. And of course, the roti moons, as I call them, is such a powerful statement. Certainly for us, it was more about what our street kids at Salam Malik Trust don't have access to. And doesn't matter whether the moon waxes or wanes or it's full, and even while it illuminates, we understand that there is so much of inequity and darkness in different parts. So thank you, Jitish, for those very beautiful images. And thank you, Sarah Suzuki, for taking the time out and being with us here today and taking us through this beautiful conversation. I hope you all have enjoyed the session, and do remember to log back on Friday, the 25th of September, to celebrate two of our writers who've been made the 2020 Booker Prize shortlist. Writing Family, Avni Doshi and Diksha Basu in conversation. Two iconic Indian women writers speak of their different takes on family life. In this conversation, the 2020 Booker Prize shortlisted author Avni Doshi and actor and writer Diksha Basu discussed the nuances of love, friendship, betrayal, alienation, and class conflict in their writing. And this is at 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 2:30 p.m. British Standard Time, and 9:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The Shadow King by Maza Mengiste in conversation with Nandini Nair. Maza Mengiste too has made the 2020 Booker Prize shortlist and is the author of Beneath the Lion's Gaze and is a 2018 recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. Here she talks to Nandini Nair about her new novel, The Shadow King, and this will be at 8:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 4 p.m. British Standard Time. 8:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 4 p.m. British Summer Time, and 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Meanwhile, as you all are aware, COVID-19 has created devastation across the cultural sector. I believe Art Matters is an advocacy and fundraising effort which will be broadcast on 4th October on Teamwork Arts Facebook and YouTube pages, as well as on Book My Show, featuring over 400 artists, including A.R. Rahman, Aditi Mangaldas, Shabana Azmi, Manoj Bajpayee, Javed Ali, Dr. L. Subramaniam, Selva Ganesh, Shiva Mani, Shekhar Avjiani, and the Shillong Choir, and so many others. And this is primarily to raise resources for those people who are backstage, artists and artisans who have nothing to their name. So please block your date, and I do hope you will join us in supporting them, because as Jitish and Sarah have shown us, art matters. Have a great evening.